What's up, you guys? Welcome back to my channel. My name is Danielle Hallen, and I am back with another true crime video. Now, I feel like there's just kind of something about the Australian outback that feels very endless and harsh and empty, and I think it's the most beautiful place. It's on my bucket list of places to go, but there's this overwhelming reality that a place like that can hold a lot of secrets. Secrets that can stay buried for years and even decades, and that is exactly what ended up happening in today's case. In 2015, just outside of the tiny town of Wynarka, South Australia, which is along this quiet, desolate stretch of highway that's lined with just farmland and dusty bushland, something was found. Something that would launch one of the most haunting investigations that the country had ever seen. And all of it started with a suitcase. A suitcase with contents that no one could have predicted. Because behind this suitcase, there had been years and years of questions from family members, investigation by police, a journey that had been filled with deception and cruelty and heartbreak, and at the center of it all was a little girl and her mother. Alone, unclaimed, unknown, until just after the suitcase was found. This is the story of Karlie and Khandalyce. Let's go ahead and jump right into the details. On July 14th, 2015, alongside Karoonda Highway near that township of Wynarka, there was a group of people going on a small road trip up to Adelaide, and they noticed something kind of strange near the edge of the highway. Because there's pretty much nothing in this area beside, I think it was like grain farms and sheep farms, there really weren't even any gas stations or anywhere to stop, so they all needed a restroom break, so they pulled over to the side of the highway, and they ended up seeing this suitcase sitting there, and it caught their attention. It was really old and weathered. It had obviously been out there for quite some time, and it was slightly open with a couple of items spilling out of it, and I feel like most people would probably see that and be like, you know what, someone was probably traveling, it fell off the top of their car. I have no reason to go and look at it, but thank goodness curiosity ended up getting the best of them. Because after they did what they needed to do, they decided to head over to the suitcase to check out what was inside. Now, right away, they could tell that this suitcase held the belongings of a small child. There was a bunch of stained, tattered clothing, sun-bleached, weather-worn, covered in dirt. So again, it seemed to line up with this idea that it was someone's vacation bag that they took with them. But then something caught their eye. There was something white peeking out from beneath a little bit of the fabric in the suitcase. And when they took a closer look, they realized it looked just like the jawbone of a child. At first, it doesn't seem like they were sure that this was human. I think a lot of people that would find something like that probably aren't going to immediately jump to, I have found human remains, unless you're someone that is very active in the true crime community. And so they saw this and were going back and forth, and they ultimately decided to just get back into their car and keep going on their journey to Adelaide. They couldn't figure out if they were just being dramatic, if they were thinking about things too far, but they could not shake the feeling that they had in fact seen a jawbone of a small child, and paired with all of the clothing found around it, they knew that they had to call the police. So they made a call, and police immediately headed out to the scene on the side of this highway. And when authorities returned and started to examine the suitcase closely, it took no time at all for them to realize that there was in fact the entire skeletal remains of a small child in the suitcase. This little child had been wrapped up in a towel, and when they found the skull, they noticed that her tiny little face had been bound with tape. A diaper was then wrapped around her head on top of that, indicating that this was a disturbing and deliberate attempt to muffle and suffocate whoever this little girl was. So what started as already a questionable situation had now turned into a little girl had been murdered horrifically, stuffed in a suitcase, and tossed along the side of a highway to be forgotten. Now, at first, authorities didn't want to release many details publicly. They didn't want to say what they found in the suitcase, around the suitcase. They wanted to focus more on identifying the child. That was obviously the utmost priority, but they also wanted to keep that information to themselves because that could be something that only the killer would know. And so it wasn't until later that they ended up confirming that these remains had been found by all these deeply personal items that painted this picture of a small little girl that had once been full of life and obviously someone loved. So how on earth was she found like this? There was a pink frilly dress and a black tutu, little red canvas shoes, a homemade quilt that was hand-stitched, colorful, something that was obviously made with love, something that probably was given to her as a gift. This was one of the most shocking and tragic discoveries that authorities in South Australia had ever encountered. But at this point, there was no sign of who this little girl was. When authorities started checking in, they couldn't find any reports at all, recent or older, of a missing young little girl matching this description. There was blonde hair found with the remains, so they at least were able to narrow it down there, but there was no family claiming to have lost a child. There was no trace of a life other than what was in the suitcase. And even when they looked in the suitcase itself, there wasn't even a name amidst all those belongings, no handwritten name on a tag or the bottom of the chute. And so they soon started to fear that somehow this little girl had slipped under the radar, that somehow, for however long she'd been out there, no one even realized she was missing. Something that seems unfathomable for a small child. And so right away, South Australian police decided to launch an urgent investigation. And so forensics experts set up camp in the very isolated bush, and they started to carefully catalog every single item in and around the suitcase, hoping that it might lead to answers. And the remains were transported to the morgue where an autopsy was conducted. The victim was confirmed to be a female toddler, which investigators had already suspected, but now they could be a little bit more specific. This little girl that had been so horrifically murdered and disposed of was likely only between the ages of 2.5 and 4 years old. And she had been there for quite some time, which made it so much worse. She had likely died several years earlier, possibly as far back as 2007. And it was 2015 at the time. How on earth does a 2.5 to 4-year-old little girl go missing, end up murdered, and it seemed like there's no one out there looking for her? Now, initially, based on accounts from nearby roadwork crews and local witness observations, police speculated that the suitcase had only recently been placed there, which threw in this whole other aspect of this crime that was so wildly unsettling. Because I guess there had been some road work in the area about 2 months earlier. I think it was in May, and those road workers said they were in that area and they didn't see a single thing. And so that meant that maybe someone had kept this little girl's remains for a period of time, and then for whatever reason in the last 6 weeks decided to get rid of it. And so that idea was absolutely terrifying for so many people. But honestly, what probably bothered me even worse is the fact that witnesses said that they had seen the suitcase on the side of the road in that entire time. And it was even stated that a couple of people walked up to it and kind of went through it. And that's why it was open and why these pieces of clothing were out there. And so it makes you wonder if someone else had seen her and also had chosen to not call it in. The whole thing is probably just one of the most unsettling discoveries that I have ever spoken about on this channel. And so they knew they had to be able to narrow down a little bit better. So as the forensic investigation continued, they did all kinds of different analysis to the items within the suitcase, and it actually revealed that this little girl had been there the entire time. For years, that suitcase had gone unnoticed, blending in along a forgotten stretch of highway, and likely washed that way with a recent storm, or was blown that way, or something happened that brought the suitcase closer to the road for it to be seen. So Detective Superintendent Desprez ended up leading the case, and in his press conference, he remained visibly affected, because who wouldn't be at this point? He said, quote, "This is a shocking, heart-wrenching case. A little girl has died in the most horrific of circumstances, and we need to know who she is." And so they started the largest investigation they possibly could to get to the truth of her identity. And so initially, investigators kind of started with just door knocks in the Wynarka area. And as I said, it's a really, really small town. There is nothing there other than farmers. And so they were going around to people saying, do you recognize this little girl? These are the items she had with her. She probably had blonde hair. She was between this age. They were canvassing nearby farms and homes, asking residents if they recognized the quilt that was with her, or if they ever remembered seeing a little girl matching the estimated age coming through the area, but no one in the area recognized anything connected to this child at all. And so they were able to at least say she isn't from here, meaning that someone very purposefully drove this child out to the middle of nowhere and dumped her. And so the search expanded. They started to reach out to neighboring towns, knocking door to door there. They contacted every preschool and daycare, early childhood center in the region. They looked at birth records from the years they believed this little girl could have been born and tried to match it to immunization records, to children being enrolled in daycares and schools. And they had compiled a list of children who were unaccounted for. They searched for all of these children to see them in person, make sure they were okay. They checked missing persons databases, but there was still no match. And so, desperate for answers, authorities decided to turn to some of the items that the child was found with. They traced the clothing manufacturers, tracking down the brands of the dress and the tutu. They identified where these things were sold and in which states. But unfortunately, it was a bunch of really generic children's clothing from places like Target or Cotton On. And so there was no really good way to trace those items back to anyone in specific, because every mother bought clothing just like it for their child. And so the last little piece of hope they had left was the homemade quilt, because like I said, that is something that a grandmother gives their grandchild when they're born or on their first birthday or for Christmas one year. It was obvious that it had been handmade by someone that had probably been making quilts for years. There was so much time and love and attention put into it. And so they hoped that maybe this grandmother or mother or whoever made it would recognize who they made it for and help identify this child. And so they painstakingly went over this entire quilt and photographed it and analyzed it and decided to release photos of the quilt out to the public, along with images of the child's clothing on a mannequin at all, hoping that someone would recognize one of these items. And sure enough, tips began trickling in. Police followed hundreds of leads, but none of them ended up pointing to an identity. And so they were incredibly frustrated. They felt like they were failing this little girl. Days turned into weeks, weeks turned into months. No one claimed this child. Again, something that seems unfathomable. And so ultimately, they dubbed her the Wynarka Suitcase Girl, which is such an awful nickname for this little baby to have. But what no one knew, not the police, not the public, was that this child had in fact been missing for years, and that over 1,000 kilometers away, in the shadows of a notorious forest, another body had been found 5 years before her. A woman that was also unknown to that day, also unclaimed, and another department that had been racking their brains for years trying to put a name on someone that had once lived a full life and now seemed to have been forgotten. And ultimately, that quilt did exactly what authorities hoped it would do, because one singular phone call ended up changing everything, not just for this little girl in the suitcase, but for this other set of remains found miles and miles away. Nearly 3 months had passed at this point since the suitcase was found, and despite their exhaustive searches and efforts, national media coverage, these authorities worked so hard to try to identify this little girl. She remained nameless. Investigators felt like they were no closer to finding out who she was or who had done this to her, but in early October 2015, all of that changed because Crime Stoppers received a call. It was actually tip number 1267. And that ended up being the one that broke the case wide open. And I so specifically wanted to mention that number because I know it can feel so hopeless. I know that it can feel like your tip might not mean anything. But this just goes to show you how long it can take for one piece of information to finally get to the right person, for them to call in with the final puzzle piece. Now, the woman on the other end of the line was a woman named Tanya Weber, and she was a longtime family friend of a young woman named Karlie Pearce-Stevenson. And Karlie had been raised in Alice Springs, which is, I believe, in the Northern Territory of Australia. And so Tanya explained she had once been really close to Karlie and her daughter, who was a little girl named Khandalyce Pearce. And she told authorities that they had lost contact years earlier in a very bizarre way that we will get into. But when Tanya saw the quilt pictured in the news reports, that and even some of the clothing, something stopped her cold because she recognized it. She remembered Khandalyce having a quilt just like that when she was younger. She hadn't seen them since 2008, but these items found in the suitcase were far too familiar to ignore. And not only that, but she actually had a conversation with Karlie's stepfather where he said he too had seen those items and felt like he recognized them. She strongly believed that that little girl could be Khandalyce. Karlie Pearce-Stevenson was a 20-year-old single mother that was originally from Alice Springs, and she had been raised her entire life by her mother, Colleen. I believe that her mom and dad split up when she wasn't even born yet. And so she was really, really close to her mom and her mom's side of the family. And they were all so supportive. They were all so loving. And Karlie herself was no different. She was known as being such a vibrant little girl. She was very affectionate. She was full of energy. And when she grew up, her independence and free spirit, they did not stop. It was very apparent from a young age. And she was especially protective and loving once she became a mother. And so Karlie was tackling something pretty challenging, which is being a single teenage mom. But she embraced motherhood with devotion. Her friends and family said that she was so attentive and nurturing. She had been like that since she was little. She was a little bit older when her little brother was born, and she always wanted to baby him and take care of him. She was just one of those people that could not wait to become a mom. And because she had such a supportive family, they made sure that they helped set her up for success. And so Karlie and Khandalyce were inseparable. They were always seen together running errands or spending time with extended family. They were always out doing something fun. And Karlie was working hard to make sure that she set her and her daughter up for a great life. She had dreams of stability and finding good work, buying a home, and raising Khandalyce in a safe environment. And despite being young and facing the challenges of single motherhood, Karlie worked hard to stay connected to her support system. She was in regular contact with her mom and stepfather, also Tanya Weber, who was her mom's best friend, and she remained grounded in Alice Springs. Everything was going great for her. She was living a dream life, at least for a while. But in 2008, everything changed. About a year or so prior to her disappearance, Karlie had started a relationship with a guy, and they were doing great. They were very stable. They ended up all moving in together, and everyone was really hopeful for their future. This guy seemed to be incredible, but for whatever reason, Karlie all of a sudden became very distant. And just months before she disappeared, she broke things off with this boyfriend. And all of a sudden, Karlie told her family she was planning on leaving Alice Springs to take a road trip around Australia. She wanted to show Khandalyce the country. She wanted to experience freedom and new opportunities in different ways and look for work. And this wasn't really shocking to anyone because Karlie was just the kind of person, she always wanted bigger and better things. And so while it seemed impulsive, it was also a very Karlie thing to do. But then she mentioned that she would be traveling with a man named Daniel Holde, a name that meant pretty much nothing to anyone that knew her. The details that Karlie gave were very vague, and her family was concerned. They didn't know this guy. He was about 10 to 15 years older than her, and when they met him the few times that they did, his behavior was so bizarre. Like, he wouldn't make direct eye contact. He would only talk to you in like one or two words. He would never engage in an actual conversation. He just gave a really creepy vibe. And so her family told her they were a little worried. They even encouraged her to leave Khandalyce behind to keep her in a stable environment while she went off and explored and did what she wanted to do. And then when she finally settled in to get her daughter, but Karlie seemed set on her decision. So by November of 2008, Karlie, Daniel, and Khandalyce headed out of Alice Springs. And at first, Karlie kept in contact with her family, which is what they fully expected. She was wanting to talk to her mom almost every single day, but obviously it wasn't exactly the same now that she was out trying to explore the world. She would send sporadic messages and occasional calls, and slowly but surely they started becoming few and far between, more spaced out. And then all of a sudden there was silence. Weeks passed and then months. Holidays that Karlie loved. Her mom said that she would never forget that first Christmas. It was not even 2 months after she left, and Christmas was always Karlie's favorite holiday, and she loved celebrating it with her mom. She loved getting gifts, she loved giving gifts, and so for Karlie to just not even call her on Christmas seemed so incredibly strange for her. And so this is exactly why Tanya Weber felt like this little girl could be Khandalyce, and maybe something awful had happened to Karlie, because after a while, Karlie was never heard from again. The messages started to become really strange, and Karlie only would reach out when she would need money or assistance with something, but it was never through phone call. It was always through text, and then eventually it seemed to stop altogether. And so at first, police didn't really leap to conclusions. They didn't immediately try to locate Karlie. The goal was to kind of try to confirm the child's identity first before making assumptions about family connections, but what Tanya Weber had said lingered. They were still thinking about it, and that this was the closest match they had so far. far. But then all of a sudden, just a few days later, Tanya Weber called back. And this was really what sealed the deal, because this time she had photographs of Khandalyce. The photos showed some of the clothing that had been found in the suitcase, but probably the most damning piece of evidence at all was one where Khandalyce was sitting in a stroller and she had a quilt draped across her lap. And there was no mistaking that it was the exact same quilt that had been found bundled up inside of the suitcase on the side of the highway in Wynarka. And according to Tanya, that quilt had been handmade by Khandalyce's great-grandmother. This was the confirmation that police needed to investigate further. They finally were starting to get to answers. And so at this point, investigators moved fast. They retrieved medical and immunization records for Khandalyce, and they were able to learn that she had received routine vaccinations up until she was 18 months old. So again, around the time that she headed off on this adventure with her mom and her mom's boyfriend. But after that point, there was nothing. Khandalyce didn't show up for any more doctor's appointments anywhere across Australia. There was no preschool enrollment. There was no documentation of her at all. It was like the moment that she left Alice Springs, she had fallen off the map. And so luckily they were able to get a DNA profile that was actually built using old blood samples from when she was born. And they were able to do a comparison to the remains found in the suitcase. And I'm sure it was such a mixture of relief that they found the truth and despair, because in the suitcase was in fact 2-year-old Khandalyce. And so with that confirmation, police turned to the next obvious step, which is, where on earth is Karlie? And at first glance, there was no active missing persons report for Karlie, but digging deeper, they did find that she had actually been reported missing in 2009 for like a very, very brief time. And the information on this particular police report is kind of all over the place, because apparently it had been withdrawn. And some sources say that the family received text messages and calls from Karlie's phone saying that she was fine. On top of that, authorities said that they were able to look into her bank accounts during this first disappearance, and they said it was super active, so they had no reason to believe that anything was wrong with her. However, not a single person had actually laid eyes on her. And so now, knowing that Khandalyce had been found in such an awful way, police and family now feared the absolute worst for Karlie. And so it wasn't out of the realm of possibilities to believe that Karlie had been silenced first, especially because she was so insanely protective of her little girl. There was no recent trace of either of them. There were no school records for Khandalyce. There were no rental agreements or employment records that matched Karlie. It was as if they both had disappeared off the map. However, oddly, there had still been digital activity when it came to Karlie. There were still texts and financial transactions that had continued on in Karlie's name for a number of years after she was believed to have last been seen. And then authorities remembered something important. And at this point, we're jumping back in time. So back in August 2010, so almost 5 years exactly before Khandalyce's remains were found, there had been another discovery of remains. There was a group of dirt bike riders that had been exploring the fire trails deep in Belanglo State Forest, which is a dense and really isolated area in New South Wales. And it is infamous for its dark history. And I can guarantee you some of you already immediately recognize this place as being the same forest where convicted serial killer Ivan Milat had dumped his victims back in the 80s and 90s. So it already had a really, really dark reputation. So these dirt bike riders were out, they were exploring the trails, and a few of them had never been on the trails before. So they were kind of hoping they were going the right direction, following the people in front of them. And one of them, by chance or maybe fate, ended up going slightly off the main trail and got lost. At the exact point that they stopped, in all of the possible places they could have gotten lost, they look over to their side and immediately notice something sticking out of the dirt and the leaves. Initially, it looked like it was maybe a white piece of stone, but something bright, stark white is obviously going to stick out in the middle of Australian bushland. So he walked closer to inspect it and realized that he had actually found a bone. And so he called out to all of his friends, and they all gathered around this site, and no one could be sure what they were looking at. Pretty much the exact same thing that happened when Khandalyce's remains were found. And so they were debating back and forth, is this animal remains? Maybe this is a kangaroo. I mean, they're in the middle of a national forest, so that's really not out of the realm of possibilities. But because of the infamous history, there's always this idea in the back of everyone's mind that maybe they had found another victim of Ivan Milat that had remained hidden in the forest decades after his arrest. So they went back and forth on all these possibilities, and ultimately they were like, you know what? This is probably just an animal. We're not going to freak out about this. So they hopped back on their bikes and continued throughout their day. But hours later, they decided to return to the spot just to be sure. And I am so glad that they did, because this time they found a human skull. Unmistakably a human skull, and partially buried beneath a thin layer of dirt and leaves under a fallen tree. So at this point, whatever doubts they had were gone. The idea that maybe this is a kangaroo, completely gone. This was now very real and very horrifying, so they immediately reached out to authorities. But authorities asked for something first: photographs, because given Belanglo State Forest grim history as a dumping ground for serial killer Ivan Milat, they were unfortunately used to receiving frantic calls on a regular basis about bones found. Over the years, panicked bushwalkers, campers, bikers had made similar reports, but every single time the remains had been animal. Personally, I'm like, thank goodness people still called, because you never know. And so when the photos came through and they saw the human skull, they were immediately convinced. And so this area was quickly cordoned off and forensic teams moved in. Now, they were able to find that the remains belonged to a woman, and her injuries were extensive, including fractures to her sternum and to her spine. All of it was consistent with a really, really violent assault. And it was also discovered that certain bones, I think it was her ribcage in particular, showed signs of her being crushed, possibly by a heavy object like someone's knee or a foot. And over time, the skeletal remains had been kind of scattered, likely disturbed and displaced by animal activity, which obviously complicated efforts to reconstruct like the original positioning of the body. But based on the soil disturbances and the level of decomposition, they felt like the remains had been there for quite some time, which was obviously huge because everyone's first thought goes to another Ivan Milat victim, which obviously the media went absolutely wild with. And so investigators painstakingly sifted through the entire surrounding area, searching for any items that could link this person to a name. There was a white sock nearby, a single silver earring. They also found a t-shirt that was faded and worn, and it had the word angelic printed across the front. And so just like with the child in the suitcase that we now know to be Khandalyce, police had tried to track down the origins of the clothing. That was really all they were left with. They followed the distribution leads and the manufacturer logs and store records, hoping that these items might have been purchased somewhere traceable to figure out, where was this girl from? Was she traveling here? Is she from the local area of Australia, or is she from a different part? And the only piece of information that they really got from that particular shirt was that it had been made and distributed in Australia between 2003 and 2006. So they knew that this young woman had to have been killed sometime from that point on. So despite a national appeal for information, no one was coming forward to claim her. And nearly a year after her discovery, authorities in New South Wales knew they were going to have to do something different to try to identify this young woman. And so they ended up turning to a woman named Dr. Susan Hayes. And she's a craniofacial anthropologist and archaeologist. She was not usually one to mess around in forensic investigations, but they reached out to her and were like, please, we need your work. We would love for you to look at this skull that we have and help tell us what she may have looked like, because we have nothing else to work off of. So she agreed to what would become a hugely groundbreaking effort. It was the first facial reconstruction of its kind in New South Wales. She used 2D imaging and soft tissue markers. She carefully recreated the likely appearance of this unidentified woman. And when they were done, they were really hoping this was going to be the thing that identified her. And so they put it out into the public. They shared it nationwide, hoping someone might recognize her, because just like the little girl that was between 2.5 and 4 years old that had a mom or a dad or a grandmother or a sibling out there looking for her, this unidentified woman was like somewhere between, I think, 13 and 25 is what they guessed. She had to have had someone too. Heartbreakingly, no one came forward. No one seemed to recognize her. And so they just continued trying to work to chip away at this case with any other details that they had. And so obviously the shirt was made buried and distributed from 2003 to 2006. The remains were found in 2010, and they were able to say that her remains had at least been out there for a year, because in 2009 they had done a controlled burn in the area. That was the last one that they had done. All of it is very thoroughly documented, and the remains showed signs of burning. And so when that controlled burn was done, her remains had already been out there. So now they were looking at 2003 to possibly 2009. But you guys, that is still such a huge amount of time. But despite all of the effort that they put into this, she remained unidentified for 5 years. And during that time, she became known as the Angel of Belanglo. Now, thankfully, authorities had been able to extract a full DNA profile from her remains. And that entire 5 years, they didn't give up. They made repeated attempts to match it against national and international databases. Year after year, comparisons were run, each time hoping for a breakthrough. I mean, they would come up with lists of like 30 to 40 people and be like, please, it might be a stretch, but it is a possibility. Test it and see if maybe we can finally give her a name. So now, with the discovery of Khandalyce's identity and Tanya Weber's tip, investigators turned back to this long, cold Belanglo case, but they knew the odds were long. It was a stretch, you guys. The remains in the forest had been found 5 years earlier, over 1,000 kilometers away, in a completely different state. It really felt like a huge stretch. And also, when they had done different testing to the remains found in the state forest, it was indicative that this person hadn't spent a lot of time in Australia. So for a long time, basically that whole 5 years, they believed they weren't finding who this young woman was because she might be from another country. But the details surrounding both of the cases were so disturbing and so unusual that police felt it was definitely worth checking. And so they first began by comparing Khandalyce's DNA profile to the DNA profile of the Jane Doe found in the forest. And to their shock, it was a match. They wanted to be absolutely sure, so they did retrieve some of Karlie's medical records and ended up obtaining a DNA sample somehow. And they wanted to directly compare the DNA taken from the woman in the forest to Karlie. And sure enough, as they suspected it would, because at this point, why wouldn't it? The match was immediate. One found in 2010, one found in 2015, a mother and daughter finally named and finally reunited in a sense all of these years later. Pieces were finally starting to come together, but instead of closure, it seemed like each new discovery only deepened the horror. The truth was devastating. Both of them had been brutally murdered, but now the question had shifted from who they were to why this happened and who could have done something so horrific to a mother and a daughter. For Karlie's family, the realization was also doubly shocking because they had never reported her or Khandalyce missing other than that one brief time in 2009 that I will get deeper into in a minute. And so I'm sure a lot of you guys are probably asking, why? Why on earth would a family not report their loved one missing if they hadn't heard from them in years? And the truth is, it's because they thought Karlie was still alive. And because of that belief, her family never raised the alarm. But unfortunately, everything they had believed all of those years had been a plotted lie. So Karlie, as I said, had been reported missing by her mother, Colleen, in September of 2009. So in 2008, she left with Khandalyce and this guy named Daniel Holde. And by September of 2009, just a few months later, her mom felt like something was deeply, deeply wrong. Now, as I said, her family had serious reservations about this Daniel guy. They had never met him before. All of a sudden, he's popping up after she was in a very secure relationship. She was happy. She was raising her daughter well, and now all of a sudden he comes into the picture and she's going to run off with her daughter. It just all was really unsettling. He had this really secretive, weird vibe to him. So in November of 2008, like I said, Karlie told her family she was going on this trip. She was going to explore Australia with her daughter. Daniel was going to be with them. And again, while it wasn't entirely out of character, she had always been spirited and adventurous and independent. This Daniel guy was really throwing everyone off. And a week into their trip, their reservations about about this adventure Karlie was going on only deepened because Karlie ended up calling that longtime friend of hers, Tanya Weber, someone that she always confided in, and she was upset. Karlie started to tell Tanya she had made a huge mistake, she wanted to come home, and while she wasn't really offering any specifics, it was clear she was anxious and frightened and emotional, and it immediately sparked concern for Tanya, who sensed that something was really wrong. But ultimately, by the end of the phone call, Karlie had calmed down. It seemed like maybe she just had a moment of second thoughts and needed a little bit of reassurance. And so while Tanya still felt a little uneasy, it didn't feel urgent enough to act right away. If only we could all see into the future. Because years later, it would be Tanya herself, the same person that Karlie had turned to in her moment of fear, that ended up calling into Crime Stoppers with a tip that cracked this case wide open. Something had, in fact, been horribly wrong, and no one had any idea. So at first, Karlie's family, especially her mother, Colleen, continued to receive sporadic texts and phone calls from Karlie, like I told you before, but all of them felt a little bit off. Her messages kind of lacked her usual tone and affection. There were photos that were sent as well. It showed Karlie and Khandalyce seemingly looking happy and healthy, smiling and together, but soon those calls stopped entirely, and Karlie would only communicate via text, and those texts became few and far between. She missed holidays, and by September of 2009, that's when her family grew deeply concerned. Colleen felt like there had to be something happening. None of this was like her daughter, especially because at this point, Karlie started saying things like she didn't want to be in contact with her family anymore. So that's when her mom reported her missing. And I kind of already got into that whole entire spiel about what happened with that. And it's one of those moments where I really wish authorities would have pushed, where the extra mile would have been taken, where they followed protocol exactly how they should, because what no one knew was that those messages that Karlie's family had been receiving, those weren't from Karlie. And those photos that they had, none of them were recent. And the text that said that Karlie didn't want contact with family, all of those were so calculated and repeated multiple times to reinforce this illusion that she had chosen to cut ties with her own family, to help explain to those receiving the text why Karlie had disappeared. All of those communications played a key role in preventing her family from realizing the truth of what was going on. Because despite her family's beliefs, everything authorities were finding showed that Karlie and Khandalyce had likely been murdered in December of 2008, just a month after leaving home. And all I can think about when hearing that is Karlie's mom waiting for a call from her on Christmas, and it never came. And little did she know it's because her daughter had already been brutally murdered. Authorities had finally unraveled the truth. So between 2009 and 2012, someone had been using Karlie's identity. Her phone, her bank cards, her government assistance, her entire existence was being stolen and played out in real time by someone else. This was years and years of manipulation. Police ended up uncovering that over $90,000 had been withdrawn from Karlie's bank account between late 2008 and 2012. The same bank account that they said was so active that she must not be missing. Instead, some other person was just using it. And so this illusion that Karlie was still alive was maintained. It was all designed to keep suspicions low, to continue this manipulation, so the person or people on the other end could continue receiving benefits. Karlie's mom, Colleen, was sending like $500 at a time to her daughter, thinking that she was helping Karlie get back on her feet, get back to Alice Springs, get back to her. And each time, it had never been Karlie that was actually receiving it. And this caused a lot of tension within the family because there were so many people, including Karlie's mom, Colleen, that wanted to believe Karlie was okay, that would continue sending this money on the chance that one of the times she would come home. But that's just not what was happening. Police at this point began to retrace every single step and every person in Karlie's life at the time of her disappearance, and Daniel Holde's name just kept on coming up, the last person that she was known to leave Alice Springs with. And when investigators looked deeper into his background, the red flags at that point were impossible to ignore. Daniel wasn't a stranger to law enforcement. He had a really long and troubling history, especially when it came to violence against women. Investigators uncovered a string of prior charges. charges, including things like domestic violence, and discovered that he had used multiple aliases over the years. He had served time in prison and developed a reputation for being manipulative and evasive. He also had charges for SA against a minor, and this was like in 2012 or 13. So after Karlie and Khandalyce had already been murdered, wherever he seemed to go, suspicion and strange things seemed to follow. Even more chilling was the testimony that would come to light later from one of Daniel's cousins. When they started digging in deeper, they wanted to see where exactly did Karlie and Khandalyce and Daniel go, and one of the last stops they seemed to make was to Daniel's cousin's home. Now, this cousin remembered that Karlie and Daniel had stayed with them in the days leading up to what police believed is their disappearance and murder in mid-December. And according to this cousin of Daniel's, Karlie and Daniel had gotten into an argument, and it was something over finances. I guess that Daniel assumed that Karlie was going to be paying for some of their accommodations, but she was arguing back that this had all been his idea, that he knew she didn't have a job, she didn't have money at the time, and so how could he possibly expect her to pay for all of these things? And so ultimately, the cousin said that Daniel decided to take Karlie on a drive to help her cool off. And so he left with Karlie in the middle of the night, unexpectedly, leaving Khandalyce behind in the care of Daniel's cousin. And Daniel didn't come back until the following morning, and he turned up alone. So obviously Daniel's cousin's like, where's Karlie? Her baby's here, we've been watching. Why do you still have Karlie's car? And Daniel claimed that Karlie basically said, I don't want to do this anymore, drop me off at a hotel. Like, abandoned her daughter, just willy-nilly said, forget all this, leave me by myself, take my car, all these things. And so all of this was raising alarms. Daniel started to say that he was going to take Khandalyce with him to drop her off with some family member of Karlie's. And he also said, oh, and by the way, I need some help trading in Karlie's car for a new one. And so his cousin was immediately suspicious. Daniel's explanation was not sitting right with him at all. And from that point on, authorities could not find anyone else who saw Khandalyce or Karlie. It was like Karlie got into this car with Daniel in an area that was only 2 hours away from the state forest she was later found in, and Karlie was never seen again. And then shortly after that, Daniel also left with Khandalyce, and she wasn't seen again either. All of this put Daniel directly in the middle of the spotlight of a murder investigation. So authorities started to try to look at cell tower data, things like Karlie's phone, Daniel's phone, and interestingly, Karlie's phone, after she was dropped off at this hotel, continued to be active for months, even after they believed she had already died. And not just that, but her phone kept pinging in locations where Daniel's phone was. So interesting how he says, oh yeah, she doesn't want anything to do with me anymore. I left her by herself without a vehicle. And all of a sudden for months, the two of them are consistently together. And not just that, but they started to look into surveillance footage when the two phones would be together. And it was always just Daniel by himself. At this point, no one had any idea where Khandalyce had gone, meaning again, he probably had gotten rid of her too. And when they continued this investigation, surveillance footage placed him withdrawing money from Karlie's bank account, but he wasn't even doing it all on his own, because all of a sudden there was a woman that came into the picture, a woman that was pretending to be Karlie in person, like talking to people at the bank, talking to people at social services, taking her money, changing her bank information. This had been an elaborate scheme. And not only that, but when they tried to look specifically into where Daniel had gone with Karlie that night, using his phone records, they were able to place him in the vicinity of the Belanglo State Forest, December 14th, 2008, which is the exact same day that his cousin said he left on this drive with Karlie, and she was never seen again. But with Khandalyce, it was a little bit different, because the truth about what exactly happened to her ended up not coming out until a stunning and horrific confession later on, when police ended up questioning that woman that had come into the picture. So now authorities had to identify who this woman was that was seen pretending to be Karlie all of these years, enjoying all of her money after she had been murdered, to see if she played a part in any of this. So they brought in Hazel Passmore, a woman whose life had become so deeply entangled in Daniel's. And she had actually been in Daniel's life before he left for this trip with Karlie. She and Daniel had actually been together and been friends with Karlie and her boyfriend. It is a whole mess that I'm going to try to untangle for you guys right now. So years prior, Hazel ended up meeting Daniel Holde during one of his attempts to reinvent himself under a new identity. And just as he ended up doing with Karlie, he suddenly approached Hazel and said he wanted to take her on a trip around Australia. So they headed off, the two of them, with Hazel's 3 children. And it's a little bit foggy. 2 of them she fathered with another man, but I guess the third one, there was question that that one was in fact Daniel's, and he claimed that child as his own. But regardless, Daniel sold this as a fresh start for the both of them, and adventure, again, sounds a little bit familiar. But the trip ended in tragedy. Imagine that. Again, in 2008. 2008 was just really not a good year. Now, after Hazel and Daniel had started taking their trip, they were going around in like a camper van, exploring everything, and finally they decided they wanted to settle down in Alice Springs. They wanted to get like more stable jobs, but little did Hazel know, at least she says she didn't know, Daniel was a drug runner. So he would take big trips multiple times a month, 15 hours to go from Alice Springs to Adelaide. He would collect a bunch of drugs, bring them back to Alice Springs, and sell them. And on one of these trips in 2008, he brought Hazel and the 3 children along. And so they were driving through in the middle of the night, and just before 10 p.m., they swerved to avoid a kangaroo, and the car ended up flipping. Hazel's 2 oldest children were thrown from the vehicle and were instantly killed, and Hazel herself was left paralyzed. I believe she actually had one of her legs amputated. It was a really, really traumatic experience, and Daniel not only was doing a drug run, but he actually tested positive for methamphetamines. He had taken drugs in the days prior to deciding to make this drive and assumed he was sober enough and sound of mind enough to make this ride with 3 young children in the back of the car. So Hazel had to deal with the loss of her 2 children, the loss of her leg, the loss of her mobility, and she was in the hospital for a really long time. And so imagine her shock when within a month of the crash, Daniel walks into the hospital with Karlie and Khandalyce at his side, and Hazel immediately suspected that something was off between them because while their whole group had been friends, they seemed awfully close. And this was all but confirmed when Daniel ended up abruptly leaving with Karlie just a day after Hazel's children's funeral. So obviously feeling betrayed by Daniel and Karlie, and after having experienced so much loss, Hazel decided to pursue a lawsuit against Daniel. It was a civil case for damages caused by the crash that left her paralyzed, the whole 9. And in December of 2008, she informed Daniel for the first time about the pending legal action. And shortly after this, Daniel took Karlie on that ride. So this entire time, he had had zero interest in speaking to Hazel or going back home. But now all of a sudden that there were possible legal charges he was facing, all of a sudden he was reaching out to Hazel that December, apologetic for leaving her, for running off with another woman. And he told her he had made a huge mistake and he wanted to come home. And Hazel was obviously skeptical, but he promised he would be back in time to bring gifts for their daughter for Christmas. And he showed up at her home just days later, only a day or 2 after Khandalyce was murdered. And so now, years later, after the remains in Wynarka and Belanglo had made headlines, police reached out to Hazel and brought her in. And so initially, she denied any knowledge of Karlie's fate. She said she was no longer with Daniel. She hadn't been with him in like 2 or 3 years, that it wasn't her problem. But through multiple interviews, her story began to unravel. They really started to put some pressure on her and show her what they had. And she ended up making a huge confession. Now, Hazel ended up revealing that she had helped Daniel access Karlie's bank accounts, and she had in fact participated in sending messages pretending to be Karlie. It was identity fraud. And she claimed that at first she believed Karlie had really run off and wanted nothing more to do with her family. And they were basically just taking it as an opportunity to get money off of it. But everything ended up changing when Hazel discovered an SD card in Daniel's possession. And when she looked on it, she realized there were graphic photos. It was images of Karlie's dead body on the forest floor. Daniel had killed her and taken pictures of it to keep as trophies. And so horrified, Hazel confronted Daniel. She was like, what in the actual hell happened to Karlie? Like, you're obviously lying to me. Where's Khandalyce? She was in a full panic. And it was during this confrontation that he finally admitted to what he had done. Daniel confessed that he had killed both Karlie and Khandalyce. It happened just as police suspected. Daniel's cousin said that he left on this ride on the 14th of December, and during that ride, Daniel took Karlie the 2 hours away to the state forest, and while there, he killed her. And by his own admission, he had stepped on her, crushing her windpipe and her chest, something that would have been immediately fatal. He then left and went back to his cousin's house. At that point, he picked up Khandalyce, threw her in the car, and he kept her alive, but only for a few short days. He was traveling around with her briefly, pretending to be her father, and at one point he checked into a motel near Narrandera, I think I'm pronouncing that right, in New South Wales, and it was there that Daniel killed Khandalyce. He wrapped her face in tape and covered it with a diaper, a horrifying method of suffocation. He then placed her body in a towel and stuffed her into one of the suitcases they had been using during their trip and decided to dump her along the side of the road near Wynarka. So Daniel had admitted all of this to Hazel. She now knew the full extent of what exactly Daniel had done, but she didn't go to police. Instead, she became even more of an active participant. Sometime after, she continued to pose as Karlie. I mean, she literally walked into a social services building. She went and got a lump sum of missed welfare checks because Karlie was dead and could not collect them. And somehow it was approved. She got all of Karlie's welfare benefits. Hazel had helped maintain this idea that Karlie was alive and well and just didn't want to be around her family. She and Daniel and their child stayed in multiple motels across different towns, and they were living off of these funds that they siphoned from Karlie's account. All of it, every trip, every transaction was their attempt to stretch out this deception as long as they possibly could to delay authorities from figuring out what was going on. And they genuinely thought they were getting away with it. And they exploited Karlie's loved ones financially and emotionally. And so when authorities hear all this, they're like, what on earth were you thinking? Like, why wouldn't you come forward and say something? And Hazel actually ended up telling them that she only participated out of fear. She said that when she found out what Daniel was capable of, she was worried that he would do the same to her and their remaining child. So she decided to cooperate. Now, when all of this information came out, critics were really quick to point out that they didn't believe a word that she said. She and Daniel hadn't been together in 2 or 3 years. So when that fear, when that risk was no longer there, no longer in her life, why didn't she come forward then to say something? And a lot of people were angry because Hazel ended up offering all this information in exchange for leniency. People wanted her to be charged, but authorities knew that her cooperation was pretty much a necessary evil to secure a conviction and ensure that there was justice for Karlie and Khandalyce. Because when she found out about the SD card, when she was scared that he was going to hurt her or their child, she gave that SD card to her sister for safekeeping just in case something happened. So the SD card with pictures attaching Daniel to Karlie's murder was still out there, and she handed it over to police. So because of this, Daniel Holde was arrested in October of 2015 for the murder of Karlie Pearce-Stevenson, and he was later charged in December also with the murder of Khandalyce Pearce. However, despite the overwhelming evidence, the legal process moved at a painstakingly slow pace, and so it wasn't until 2018, nearly 10 years after the murders, that he finally stood in front of a judge. And this time, he changed his plea to guilty. He had initially tried to fight it, but I guess for whatever reason, he decided to just plead guilty and move forward. So he avoided a jury trial, and thank goodness, because Karlie's family had already been through enough. Now, during sentencing, the judge described Daniel's crimes as, quote, evil in the extreme, and sentenced him to life in prison without the possibility of parole. He would never see the outside world again. The court acknowledged the disturbing lengths that he went to in order to cover up his actions and deceive Karlie's loved ones. I mean, multiple police agencies had been dedicated to even just trying to identify who these two girls were. Even by the the end of the sentencing, there was no clear motive. And considering his history of violent behavior, he really did just see an opportunity and he ran with it. But finally, after nearly a decade, justice was served.
A judge described as appalling depravity. And for his crimes, Daniel James Holde has been given 2 life sentences. Karlie Pearce-Stevenson and her daughter Khandalyce were found 5 years and 1,200 kilometres apart, and today loved ones applauded as their killer was jailed.
Daniel James Holde arrived at court with a bombshell announcement, a decision to reverse his guilty plea. A hammer blow for the victim's family, but the judge dismissed it, labelling the brutal murders of the single mum and her toddler daughter as among the worst.
A murder of extreme gravity and appalling depravity.
In 2008, Holde drove Karlie to Belanglo State Forest, Ivan Milat's killing ground. He sadistically abused her, killed her by stomping on her throat.
He compounded this further when he took photographs of his unspeakable mistreatment, which he kept as a vile trophy of his own inhumanity.
He drove Khandalyce to a hotel near Wagga, suffocated and stuffed her in a suitcase and dumped it on a remote South Australian highway. The family's heartbreak described as unquantifiable.
His brutality will haunt us forever. Nothing done to him will bring Karlie and Khandalyce back.
Before they were found, Karlie's mother died of cancer. Her final words, asked where they were.
They have suffered enormously for the past 10 years.
The court heard Holde had an atrocious childhood, a stepfather that constantly beat him, starved him, poured hot water on him, locked him up. He'd run away from home, the police would bring him back again. On drugs from the age of 11, he attempted suicide 3 times. But today, Justice Hume said he was forced to put all of that aside. His criminal history spans 4 states and territories, even had a fantasy list of children to abuse.
Within that notebook, in his handwriting, was a list of about 30 children, identified by their age and sometimes their first name.
Holde received 2 life sentences. The family clapped as he was led from court.
But the pain that was left behind was immeasurable because Karlie was only 20 years old. Khandalyce was only 2, and they were both robbed of their futures, of their voices, of their chance to live a life that they both deserved. On top of that, Karlie's mother and grandmother both passed away before those remains were ever identified as being their loved ones. They died having no idea what happened to them. And honestly, while they absolutely deserve to know the truth, I'm almost happy they were spared the pain of knowing the horrific things that were done to them. And Karlie's biological father, someone that her and Daniel had stopped by to try and visit on some of their journey, unfortunately had been out of town at the time, and that would have been his first time ever meeting his granddaughter Khandalyce. And now that opportunity was also robbed from him. Karlie had dreams of raising her daughter, of building a stable life. She had fought hard to stay close to her family and give her child a better future. Khandalyce was such a sweet and innocent little girl, always smiling, and I'm at least thankful that her entire short life was filled with love. Daniel had again taken advantage of a situation. He had tricked Karlie, hoping that he could get something positive out of it. It was his typical pattern of when something didn't work out for him, he decided to just lose his mind in every way possible. This had been something that he had done ever since he was a little child. And according to those in his life, he was a pathological liar. He was manipulative. There's no telling who he pretended to be while he was with Karlie to convince her that she would be safe with him, that Khandalyce would be safe with him. And the public outrage over this case was enormous because people across Australia were stunned not just by the brutality of the murders, but also how long the victims were able to remain unidentified. It's not like the media hadn't extensively covered the story. I mean, there were nightly news segments, front page headlines that were dedicated to them for weeks and weeks and weeks. Social media was flooded with anger and heartbreak as people demanded, answers and accountability. While authorities had in fact launched a full-scale investigation into both sets of remains that had been found, they followed hundreds of leads. The fact that a mom and daughter could be murdered, hidden in plain sight, and impersonated for years without anyone realizing the truth, that I think is what really haunted people. It kind of highlighted just how easily someone could slip through the cracks despite the best intentions of law enforcement. And I don't think anyone wants to believe that that's a possibility. There ended up being reforms to Australia's welfare and benefit system. They introduced new policies that would require significantly more thorough identity checks for anyone collecting payments. And they also spent a lot of time trying to figure out how a child that has no way to speak for themselves, no way to protect themselves, also managed to kind of slip away without anyone noticing for so long. So at least their deaths were not in vain. Things were done, things were changed to help make sure that no one else could suffer the same fate and it go undiscovered for so long. To this day, their case remains one of Australia's most tragic and haunting crimes, and the quilt that had been found with Khandalyce was eventually returned to her family. It had once represented something entirely different, but now it at least kind of served as this thread connecting them to what they still had in their hearts. And while thankfully Daniel will never walk free again, there are still so many questions that linger beyond him. Like, are there others who have suffered a similar fate that have gone unnoticed? And how on earth do you make sure something like this can never happen again? Because Karlie and Khandalyce both deserve better. They deserve to be found. They deserve to be protected, and their story should never be forgotten. It's a prime example that you don't ever truly know who someone is on the inside. There are unfortunately people out there that are master manipulators that always have a mask on. So do what you can to protect yourself, to protect your loved ones, and always speak up if you feel like something is wrong. And if you ever find yourself in a position, don't be afraid to ask for help. On that note, I'm going to go ahead and go, you guys. Thank you so much for taking the time out of your day to listen to Karlie and Khandalyce's story. Hopefully there is something that you took from it. If you haven't already, go ahead and hit the subscribe button down below to become a part of the Hallen fam so that we can hopefully bring them home together or bring them justice together. And I will see you guys in my next video.